Buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Be welcome again to our third international seminar on slavery, reparations, and colonialization. In this third session, we are here with and Rebeca Igreja from University of Brasilia. There has been significant rain, and this has had a significant effect. We are moving towards a path of a new society. There's no person saying, I'm sorry, but I'm hearing the French interpreter in my channel, so there is a problem. I'm hearing the French interpreter in my channel. Please, can you correct this? This is what we're doing here to share the experiences. That is the topic of reparations. The topic of reparations of the crimes committed against our peoples. And that, as we said during the first class, these were not crimes that remain in the past, but that have consequences in the present. That is why it's so important for us to study this topic and turn this into concrete actions. That's the reason that has gathered us here. Today, we will continue our event. I would like to greet the attendees on Zoom. We have attendees joining us from Mozambique, in China, and other countries who are hearing with a great deal of attention. Greetings to all of you, brothers and sisters of the world. Now I'm going to give the floor to Isamar Ochoa to make a summary of what we have done so far. Thank you, Guillermo. Good morning. Rebecca, be welcome once again. And also welcome once again all of the attendees. Yesterday we were speaking about the different aspects of this multiculturality approach as a proposal that is opposed to the racist policy that is behind this false discourse of racial equality that we described during the first session. And today we will continue deepening on these topics along with Rebecca in this road of review of history and making a comparison with the perspectives that have been discussed in our country. Yesterday, I had to leave earlier, and I apologize for that. I was not able to be until the end yesterday, but I hope to stay today until the end of the event. Without further ado, I would like to remind you to keep your phones off or in silent mode. We are broadcasting for YouTube in our channel related to the decolonization topic. And now, without further ado, we're going to give the floor to Rebecca to start the session. Good morning, everyone. We continue with this topic. I appreciate your patience because it's there's a couple of discussions that are important to be made. And that is why I try to give a space for that, to have more time for an exchange, for a conversation. And I hope that tomorrow we can hold the dialogue. I would like to know more about the experience of Venezuela. Today, as I promised, we are going to speak about the affirmative action policies in Brazil and this change that took place after the constitution that was approved back in 1988. And today we are celebrating the 35th anniversary of the Brazilian constitution, one of the most progressive constitutions in terms of rights in Latin America, that also recognized the pluralism of our societies. Unfortunately, I was saying that is a complicated day because, as you may know, on January 8th, after Lula's election, there was an attempt of the three branches of public power to impede Lula from taking the presidential control. We have been discussing in the Supreme Court, and there have been contradictions, but we have a Supreme Court that has been reaffirming the defense of the Brazilian democracy. And during the administration of Bolsonaro, this court was very important to protect public policies and the country as a whole, especially during the pandemic when we saw a strong negationism of the disease. Brazil is one of the main producers of vaccines in the world, and suddenly we started to see a large number of people stopping vaccinating themselves because there was a campaign against vaccination. And that is why there is so much emphasis on combating this fake news about the use of vaccines that were promoted by Bolsonaro. It was a strong campaign against the COVID treatments. So the Supreme Court held a key role in this process, and at this moment, under our constitution, several cases had been studied about these people that attempted this coup d'etat. That is why the Supreme Court is bringing these people to justice. So there is a true um, accountability process against this attempt of coup d'etat against Lula. And yesterday, precisely, we started to see these different visions that are facing each other. And in the National Congress in Brazil, we see a control of the right wingers, and the parliamentarians voted trying to control the decisions of the Supreme Court. They wanted to review the decisions of the Brazilian Supreme Court that is in charge of judging the constitutional character of the bills of law passed by the Congress. And precisely, apart from what is going on in the courts against the plotters, there was a discussion in the court of creating a temporary framework for the indigenous peoples in Brazil. What's this? Well, in Brazil, there was an interpretation that the guarantee of the indigenous territories in Brazil can only be guaranteed based on the indigenous inhabitants that were already in these territories, according to the law of 1988 when the new constitution was approved. If you were not there, you don't have the right to claim these territories. However, many indigenous people have been expelled from those territories, and there was no clause in the constitution that specifies a period that defines this right of these indigenous inhabitants to claim the recognition of the tenancy over this land. So the Supreme Court made a ruling and said there is no point in having a temporary framework concerning this claim of the indigenous peoples about their land. So, as a vendetta, the federal Senate wanted to impose their control over the Supreme Court, and they were basically trying to challenge the power of the judiciary. And in this week, what we are witnessing is several bills of law that are being discussed, trying to reduce the power of the judiciary and even to limit the tendency of the judges of the judiciaries in the Supreme Court. And this is being discussed at the time being in our faculty of law in the university because they're trying to control the decisions of the Supreme Court. This is to tell you that, in a nutshell, in this 35th anniversary of our Constitution, we see a general attack against the power and the authority of the Brazilian Supreme Court as a result of the decisions that have been ruled by the judges. So there is an attempt of control by the right wingers over the court. And this is related to us. They are affecting us. The Brazilian academia. The Brazilian academia was also attacked by the government of Bolsonaro and the neo-Pentecostals in Brazil. And they are trying to create difficulties to hinder our work. So there are several situations taking place that we are living. And unfortunately, yesterday in nighttime, one of the brothers of one of our allies, a deputy, was killed, who was trying to precisely fighting against the efforts that wanted to be taken against the MST. And unfortunately, this person was killed in Rio de Janeiro. So nothing is guaranteed, unfortunately. We have an extremely good constitution that defends the rights of the minorities and the most vulnerable populations. However, we have a Congress that has turned to the right and that precisely is pro-Bolsonaro. So we are still living a large number of tensions in Brazil, which it causes remarkable instability. So what happens with our constitution? We have many studies affirming, yes, our constitution is beautiful. However, it is not as effective as we wanted to guarantee the rights of people, especially vulnerable people. On the other hand, this is our most precious element. So we see these attempts of coup in the Congress and these bills of law that pretend to be over the Constitution, like this temporary framework that I was describing, which is totally out and tries to violate the fundamental constitutional rights. And I make specific reference to this temporary framework that affects the indigenous people because they are violating the rights that are guaranteed by constitutional clauses that should not and cannot be altered. Okay? These clauses that are not subject to be touched. And this temporary framework against the indigenous people is trying to violate this clause that protects the most fundamental rights of the Brazilian indigenous population. So I was highlighting this special moment of celebration of our constitution, and I wanted to bring forward these concerns. And I wanted to mention as well to the elements that I'm going to mention today. After the approval of the Constitution and after seeing the participation enhancement, the Constitution ended up granting a high degree of participation to grassroots movements since the 70s after the process of the disappearance of the dictatorship. There was a strong movement uh, with the black people, with the homeless people, and the constitution enhanced the participation. During the voting procedure that took place in those years, several deputies were elected who were leaders of the communities, especially from the Afro movement in Brazil, and that helped to guarantee the rights of minorities. Another element that is important to highlight is the guarantee of affirmative action that were and continue to be seen all over the country. And they were so widely present in our country that even during the administration of Bolsonaro, in the light of these attempts of reduction of rights, they were not successful in reducing this affirmative action at the level of municipalities. Instead, we saw an increase of affirmative action policies. But the success of affirmative action policies has to do with their application. And I think this is the most important element to highlight, to understand and pay attention to the particularities of Brazil. Understand how Brazil applied this criteria of affirmative action to frame this in the broad policy of structural support and do not limit itself as a focused policy. So to understand this and how this has had an impact in the policy of equality, it's very important. And this is something that is present in our law. If we can go to the PowerPoint we were using yesterday, and I will tell you what the slide is, slide 39. Let's go to slide 39. Exactly, where I speak about the racial equality policies. So about affirmative action, countries speak about positive discrimination. I don't use that term that much. In Brazil, we speak about affirmative action. So the classical definition of affirmative action has to do with private or public policy with the purpose of granting specific resources of right to members of disadvantaged social groups, vulnerable, typically referred to the classificatory and the limiting dimensions of ethnicity, race, social class, gender, religion, caste, among others. That is to say, affirmative action are not policies designed for Afro populations. They can be elaborated for any group that is in a condition of disadvantage or in a vulnerable condition in society. Their implementation can be extended to different social domains such as access to education, culture, health, and employment. It can also be oriented towards the promotion of cultural recognition and the anti-racist struggle. In this way, it is understood as an instrument to combat racism and as a reparation for the suffering inflicted on populations that are victims of discrimination. That is to say, one of the first definitions and one of the key definitions of affirmative action is that they are policies of reparation. So the policies of affirmative action are different from one country to another.
What type of policies they make? Because the quotes or the establishment of racial quotas is not the most common for the affirmative actions, and which is the level of juridical standards that are established which are constitutional, legislative, administrative, and which are the environments. It can be applied in the area of justice, in the area of education, in all the areas that are social. In the next slide, and I will continue there, affirmative action can be understood as focalized policies, and it is very important to say that they can be applied both in public policies as well as in private policies. And the objective is to grant resources or special rights. We can continue. If you're interested with the PowerPoint. But the first country that has implemented the affirmative action is this one, and people take as reference the United States. It's a worldwide policy, and then we have the United States, and now Brazil. But it is not a North American policy from the beginning. And each one of those countries established them in a different way. But the most interesting thing that we can discuss is that this is a policy that is focalized to attend to rights to specific groups, minority groups. But in the countries that have extended these actions, like India and Malaysia, the affirmative actions have been designed for large populations. In Brazil, for example, we cannot see, on the contrary, half of the population is African. But these are policies that are focalized to attend or to assist majority populations. If we continue with the next slide, please. There is something that is very interesting, and that is that I include there the United States to show you how the same social policy can have uses and justifications that are different. What do I mean by this? When the affirmative actions were elaborated and the United States, in all this current of civil rights, the fight for the civil rights in the United States, which was designed in the 60s with the foundation of the reparations of the historical and the social justice. This was the reparation for the judgments that the African American people had with slavery in the country. And this idea of promoting policies that allowed to insert members of these groups in spaces that normally were excluded, either due to discrimination, either due to difficulties that they have had historically in the labor market and in education, for example. So they thought about a series of policies that, as you will see, the insertion and the integration of representatives of this minority was done in spaces that they could not access before. This is the basic principle of the affirmative action that do not has as such any electoral policies. The idea is to in the social spaces where they are excluded. Further on, there was a change, and the affirmative actions of the United States should be presented as historical reparations, and they started to be promoters of social justice. This seems to be quite interesting, but on the other hand, this opens the possibility where it can be applied to different minorities at the same time. And this idea of rendering accounts, historical accounts of the country with the African descents with slavery gets lost amidst a policy that turns into a social justice in general. But the affirmative actions change again from justificative, and it takes out the neoliberal government of Ronald Reagan. And what transforms the justification of affirmative action is not the social justice anymore, is the diversity. Didn't like much the term diversity is because of this, because it signifies the diversity. It's the society as a whole gains if it's diverse. It has members of the different minorities, of the different social groups. And this coincides with multiculturalism. And this extends the affirmative actions for the whole societies, for the societies to be diverse. And this also means and turns into economic discourse because during these same years, the United States started to do the management, diversity management, where they had the idea of including the importance for the companies of also means an increase or a recognition of a market of a wider consumption. So attracting all these groups by improving the situation, the economical situation, for them to be able to insert in this financial market. And they had this idea of promoting policies for the Black migrants could enter and could start working in the companies by promoting the diversity in the companies. And in this way, they thought about the economy and about the consumption market in an extensive manner when the country was extremely pluralist. So there was always a critique during the 70s of the because the integration of these people rarely got there in the spaces of command of the companies, like the public sector, in the positions of commandment or decision making. These people didn't reach those positions. In general, all these policies located these minorities in positions that were lower, in lower positions of the bureaucratic structure. But I wanted to show this to let you know how they can take different decisions. Of course, the first generations of affirmative actions in the United States had great benefit with policies. It was very important to promote the entrance or the integration of representatives of these minorities in these spaces. However, also the affirmative actions that could be criticized from the United States. First, the problem that I mentioned before. When there are problems of resources, financial resources, when there is a problem with social policies, when there's an economic crisis in the United States, these populations then, even with the affirmative actions, they are not able to benefit from them. The financing crisis of the Black colleges, the problem where the population finishes scholarity with lots of difficulty. And I'm not going to talk about this right now, but with the economic crisis, there are different blockages for this policy to work. And besides, if we take the political affirmative actions like the ones in the United States, we do perceive the presence of lots of Black people, African descents, of people from other minorities in the universities. Nevertheless, many of them are foreigners. Many of them come to the United States from families that pay Arabic people as well, and they occupied this space of affirmative actions. This is a space where the African American see more difficult. I mean, it's more difficult for them to have access to them. So it was to widen the affirmative action in this way. But then we have this sense of historical reparation, of a historical review, and it has a diversity policy. It is important to have all different sorts of faces. And as we say in Brazil, the process of doctrinization, where we elect one Black person, one woman, because we recognize the demands. But it is important to have the face of these people to know if they are representatives, to indicate if it's a company or a public institution that is diverse. So this is quite present in the United States. They aroused after the crisis of 2008, and it is quite present amongst the intellectuals of African descent. And that nowadays, like in Brazil, there's a shock with another moment that the basis of the extreme right of the United States, with what we have seen in the newspapers of the candidates of the Republican Party, there is one of them that is of an Indian origin that criticizes what they call the diversity policy and equity policy and inclusion in the United States, and the backlog of the Supreme Court of the United States that rejected the application of the affirmative actions in the universities based on a process initiated by the Asian people who felt harmed, and they didn't have access to the spaces that were reserved for other types of populations like the African descent. The racial quotas, the establishment of the percentages of spaces for African Americans or for women, etc., was not allowed in the United States. These are policies of incentives for the integration. What some universities do is that when they evaluate the candidacies, they give preference to representatives of these minorities. These are small policies of incentives for the introduction of representatives of these minorities. This is another aspect. Can we continue with the next slide? This is another important aspect. These are not policies. These are not policies that are collective. They have a very important collective impact, but they are not collective policies. They are policies that promote the integration of individuals that represent these groups that can be divided into those who do not participate in the social movement, those who do not have a political participation, etc. These are representatives of individuals that they declare themselves depending on their color or their gender. But we're talking about individuals. This is very important. I don't know if the definition of the policy is clear. I had mentioned before that when there was a discussion of the multiculturalism, they talked specifically about the Black diaspora and how they would fit that into these policies. And what they proposed was to recover the affirmative actions by extending them to these groups. What happened in Brazil after the Constitution? Just give me 1 second, please. There was, even before the Constitution, there was a very large march held on November the 20th It was the March of Palmares against racism for life. It was a march that had a lot of repercussion in the country, where they demanded the state to produce policies that could assist the demands of the people of African descent. Fernando Enrique Cardoso, when he got to power in Brazil, he was part of the project of the UNESCO. And his discourse, when he took power, he said that he assumed, and this is true, he said that there was racism in Brazil. This was an important point of the president. It was quite symbolic. He said that they had to try to fight against racism that existed in his country. But his government, which is close to the neoliberalist, was quite contradicting in this sense, because Fernando Enrique defended the policies and started the creation of a series of commissions that we call work teams to discuss which policies could be elaborated in this sense, including the affirmative actions. He organized a seminar that he called Multiculturalism and Racism, the role of the affirmative action in the democratic spaces. He invited intellectuals from North America and intellectuals from Brazil for them to discuss about these policies. And he did not assume, he put the intellectuals together for them to discuss. Something quite sui generis happened as a result of this. Anthropologists were invited, the most important areas was precisely education. I told you before that with the Black movement, education was always taken into account. The fight against racism must start with education, with change in education and in the school's curriculum. So we had a situation of a president who said that he supported the supply of education, that he rejected the affirmative actions, and there was a very strong pressure from authorities and scholars in favor or against the establishment of the affirmative actions policies. I'm talking about the year 2000.
What happens in the middle of this discussion is that the Ministry of Education started a project called Diversity in the University that I have explained, that universities in Brazil were occupied or taken by the elites. So this project about diversity started, and I was responsible for designing the first draft of this project that was going to be financed by the Inter-American Development Bank and UNESCO. And the idea was that what type of policy could be designed that could go beyond these quotas because there was so much resistance. And so there were these initiatives that I had mentioned before, especially in Rio and in other parts of the country, about courses that were offered for Afro population or people in conditions of vulnerability, precisely to grant access to them to the university. So there was a project at the Ministry of Education that rendered easier the entrance at the university of people who were poor or people who had studied in the public education system and not in private schools and Afro descendants. So I saw that the Ministry of Education was doing something else, so I got disappointed. So basically, what they were using was putting resources in some courses, and it was not a state policy in the end. So it was disappointing. So something strange derived from this, because the whole thing, the whole organization of Durban and the delegation of Brazil, that was one of the largest ones that participated in this Durban conference, was organized by representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and black organizations without the Ministry of Education. Even the affirmative action part was designed without the participation of the Ministry of Education, that in the end was the most important entity that should have participated. And something else happened. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that is the House of Oligarchs in Brazil, and we need to say this openly and everyone knows it, started a project of quotas. But then later on, they started a project of scholarships, of preparation for the exam to become a diplomat. You need to take a competitive examination to be a diplomat. It's one of the most difficult ones in the country, and it's offered every year. There are 15 positions open, and the idea of the ministry is offering a scholarship of a year. It was a year or 2 years, I don't remember precisely, for Afro descendants, so that they can pay and afford the course of preparation for the exam to become a diplomat, a language course. You to take this examination, you need to speak English, French, and Spanish, a language course, so that they can present themselves to this competitive examination to become diplomats. This is the type of incentive that was created, and the Ministry of Agrarian Reform also established policies of reform, policies in this regard at that moment. So there were several policies appearing, and in the middle of the debate, the, there was a movement for reparations. That is a group of black leaders that started the promotion of debates and discussions to promote affirmative action in Brazil as a compensation policy in favor of enslaved Afro descendants. And this was quite interesting in Brazil, because there is one day in Brazil that is celebrated for lawyers and law students. They go to a restaurant and then they say they don't pay the the check. In it's a tradition that we have in Brazil. And there is a small group of black leaders who went to a restaurant in Sao Paulo, a very fancy restaurant. They ate, and imagine everybody was staring at them. Oh, these people are here in these restaurants. They ate everything, and then they stood up and they said it's necessary to have a reparation movement for the slavery that took place in Brazil. And a very important personality of this movement was Fernando de Conceição, who was the national coordinator of the movement for reparations in Brazil. And let's continue, please. So at this moment of dispute, Pierre Bourdieu, the French philosopher, who I like a lot, Pierre Bourdieu published an article that called the imperialist reason, along with Bacon, where Pierre Bourdieu states that the promotion of affirmative action in Brazil were not less or more than the US imperialism taking place in Brazil, that what we were doing was a copycat of an American policy, and that affirmative action, what we're going to promote in Brazil, was the fragmentation of population and races, something that we were not familiar with, that was typical from the US, and as it was interpreted, could end up fostering a racial conflict that didn't exist in Brazil. This article by Pierre Bourdieu made a lot of noise and fed the position against affirmative action. And when I was speaking about this dispute between sociologists and anthropologists, this was an interesting moment because the anthropologists were saying, well, the mainstream of anthropology, the Association of Anthropologists in Brazil, were saying, well, racial democracy is not a fact. We know that. But we can consider it as a myth. A myth, not as a lie, but as a myth, as the anthropological sense, as something that we can reach someday, such as the idea, since this idea of racial democracy is very interesting, let's invest our time in making this myth to turn into a reality that instead using focalized policies that oblige people to define themselves based on the race and color. Because the idea of classification by race and color is an idea that was established by the racist theorists. The race and does not exist. So we are reinforcing the concept race that should disappear. So there are no human races. And as you remember, I mentioned this discussion about the demographic biases that the geneticists started to say, no, biology does not have anything to say about the establishment of races. You cannot use this to frame racial differences. So this has been the position expressed. And the sociologists on the other side, who were exploring more statistics since the 70s, there were statistics in Brazil that were showing that among the most vulnerable and poor people were black people. And the sociologists were affirming, look, statistics are showing that it's necessary to conduct efficient and quick policy to integrate members from these communities. So we have two academic projects about the same policy with a different perspective. One with fear of having a racial conflict, and they are still discussing the need for recovering the concept of race. There are a lot of discussions in Mexico, among other countries, about the use of the concept of race, and the position mostly assumed by the sociologists saying, look, statistics are showing that it's necessary to have an aggressive public policy of integration of Afro-descendants. So I'm going to apologize for a typo or something that is in the slide where it says the brown category. The word is pardo, not brown. I apologize because I read marron in Spanish and it caught my attention. Pardo is what should be written there. And so there started to be a defense of black movements later on, because there were organizations at that moment that were saying, look, it's very important to focus on educational policies. We're not going to establish these discussions now. Well, we are speaking about times in which white people were not affirming themselves as white people, so oblige people to say, I'm black, I have rights. Some organizations were perceiving this as complicated. And these mini courses for entering the university, these mini courses could be considered like mini courses for poor people. And there were movements back then that were linked to trade unions, the black trade union movement, who were saying it's not good to promote this type of policies that are focalized. We want a true transformation of the labor relations. And all of these discussions were framed in this universe of uh, organizations. Uh, so affirmative actions were there, and we have a person that I just mentioned, and he had an organization called EduCafro that promoted these mini courses for people to enter the university, those that belonged to these vulnerable groups. And what he was saying is that affirmative actions had not to do with a focalized policy, that it was important to improve public schools that would enable these students to enter the university later on in life. But what he was saying is that educational policies tend to be unstable, like democracy in Brazil. They change all the time. So we are not going to wait for a century to finally have decent schools so that we can finally see the vulnerable people entering the universities. So affirmative action then, at that moment, showed that it was the most favorable policy to be applied. Another important aspect to be debated had to do with this discussion that was so tense. We need to think about social policies or policies that define racial categories. So there was a discussion that was broad. I was at the Ministry of Education, so I had a first-hand experience on this regard. Even if we have, for example, the indigenous in peripheric areas and that do not receive a great deal of attention, they have a different level of recognition in terms of their identity. So in some projects, there was an increase of the quotas for indigenous people because it was a way to legitimate affirmative action as a policy for alterity, given the fact that the racial question that has to do from the point of view of many as something related to color than instead of culture, and it was difficult. And in this policy, we see this addition of the indigenous people. But at that moment, the struggle of indigenous people was for bilingual education, for indigenous universities and indigenous schools, and not for a society uh, and that is not taking into account the collective. They are taking into account individuals to take them to university. And we can mention the positive aspects of affirmative actions for indigenous people. But I'm trying to give you a context of the discussion around a policy that we had. And the problem was this pardo category and continues to be the problem today. You saw when I shared with you the statistics that the black people has a percentage of 17%, but the larger population is pardos. Who are the pardos? That's in this moment. Who are the pardos? Where do they come from? For example, people from the northeast of Brazil, that in this process of migration, they suffer a very specific type of migration that is phenotypic and cultural in Sao Paulo and Rio and Brasilia. So, for example, when we speak about the discrimination that people from the northeast of Brazil population suffers, so so some people say, oh, no, you cannot define people from the northeast of Brazil as black because they're not. They suffer a specific type of discrimination. The whole idea about black population, well, it's a population that is integrated in modernity, and the whole idea of what the Northeast represents, it has to do with tradition and a different type of culture. They're discriminated on their way of speaking, the accent. So people from the northeast of Brazil end up in a different category when it comes to the types of discrimination they suffer. So when people from the northeast of Brazil come to Brasilia, Rio, to other parts of Brazil, they are called in a derogatory manner paraibas, as if they all come from the same place. It's a derogatory way to be called. So they are pardos. Are we going to place them in the same position where the blacks are? Then we have the indigenous. They are not recognized in their category because there is not enough recognition of the communities, and there's still a bad categorization in the census. And at this point, I would like to mention the self-declaration. Indigenous people or indigenous descendants need to sometimes be introducing themselves as black to have access to quotas because they are categorized as pardos. And the discussion was very complex. There are states or regions with more black population. There are other regions that has pardo population. So, for example, the Amazonas has a large population of indigenous people, and the category to be considered as black or pardo depends on the regional criteria. So the percentage that we start to see with regard to black people is low. So the processes end up being complicated. So according to my birth certificate, I'm not white, but pardo, but I'm not a beneficiary of racial quotas.
So who are the pardos that benefit from the racial quotas? In this period, the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro began a process of affirmative action for quotas for the entry into the university. And the University of Brazil also made a program of racial quota. And there's a point there that is very important, and I forgot about it. The other proposal that there was that the affirmative actions could not be based on color or race of the people. They had to be based on social quotas. That is, that they should be established for students that came from public schools. They were going to be they would benefit Black people indirectly because they were overrepresented in the lowest strata of the society. So they would be indirectly benefited. We did demand the identification, the racial identification. However, there was also a discussion by the Black movement who said that for the affirmative actions to have a inter-racist sense, we need to make visible the African population. And this led to some quota policies that were used in the universities. And these quotas were designed for Black people without taking into consideration if those people had studied or not in the public schools, without considering the education of these people. They identified themselves as Black people. They could have access to the quotas without questioning their socioeconomic status. So you can see that the situation or the discussion is quite complex. The discussion about the establishment in a country that has a very diversified population and that has a social economic situation that is quite unequal. When the University of Brasilia started the discussion about the establishment of the quotas, what the University of Brasilia did was to create a commission for the verification of the self-declaration of the people, the race self-declaration of people. It was a commission formed by anthropologists, representatives of the Black movement, and the candidates for the quotas would come through this commission. They would take pictures of those people, and the commission would decide if that person was Black or not, and if that person could have access to the quota or not. The anthropology said that they were establishing racial courts in Brazil, and this was not accepted. And likewise, I'm talking about this because this is so complex. But there were two twins, identical twins, who went to the commission in different moments. One was categorized as Black, and the other one was not considered as Black. So this was a reason for the right people to publish in the most conservative journals what was being created with the establishment of racial quotas. The university decided to take out the pictures to eliminate the need of pictures, but kept the existence of the commission and the commissions of self-declaration, of verification. Today is a standard, is something that exists and that is established in the concourses, which is an aspect that we can talk about because there's also a was Black, and that was not completely true. And the mother was completely white. And as we all know, in Brazil, this is not what is going to determine to suffer racism. In Brazil, in the lowest strata of the society, maybe someone can have two brothers that are white and one brother that is Black. And the Black person is a candidate to the quota while the white brothers are not. So this is now under debate in this moment. And we designed two manifestos. There were two manifestos even in the group of people who were linked to the left, one in favor and one against the quotas, and they were presented in the National Congress. And the scholars and the anthropologists and the sociologists. Brazil. Let's continue. You will not be able to read this, but how can we identify this population that is going to be benefited from the policies? Another problem was the idea of the Black community that was territorialized and that could be benefited from this policy. Of course, the political narrative of the quilombos was one way of creating this idea of the community. But once again, we are talking about a population that is quite urbanized, is quite diverse from a cultural standpoint and from an ethnicity standpoint. Half of the population, even the Pardos, it is very difficult to delimit the idea of a Black community. We are not talking about the quilombos, by the way. We're talking about the same way that genetic was not the solution, the idea of the community was not a solution. We cannot say, I'm going to take out representatives of communities to integrate them in the quotas. how was this done for the indigenous people? When the indigenous people presented themselves for the quota, some universities demanded the letter from the leader of the community attesting and certifying that this is a real indigenous person from the community. And this could not be done for the Black people. It was impossible. And the discussion about the Black community goes from definitions, and Muniz, who is a Black intellectual who is well known in Brazil, what he said was that they could design the idea of a Black community like a group of activists of Black leadership in the country that form these groups that represent the society. Can we go to the next slide? The quotas for the indigenous people. This is an anthropologist, indigenous intellectual from the University of Brasilia. Jessom Jessen is written there. Jessin Benio, what he said was that although the affirmative actions are very important for indigenous people, as it contributed to their full and differential citizenship in their dialogue, and they constitute an important multicultural space, it is important to pay attention to some measures. Why? Because the main characteristic of the indigenous rights, and I cite what says there, is the difference and equivalency and not the equality or similarity. So the indigenous people have demanded on having the focus of the policy on the valoration, on the recognition of the differences versus the and not the inclusion and homogenization of the policies, even in the area of policies for the diversities or social minorities. In many cases, the inclusion policies that are well intended may signify the exclusion, the social political exclusion. What Baniwa is saying, what Gerson Baniwa is saying is that not only the integration of those indigenous people have to have links with the communities, because you can even take the quota for indigenous who are not combined with the communities and that are in the urban sectors. And also what type of education they're going to have access to in the university, what type of teachings they're going to have access to, how are they going to reflect their culture, where is the bilingual essence that they have. So there's a series of elements because the political is very clear when it establishes the affirmative actions. Today in the universities, this is quite large, not only in the courses of anthropology, but in other courses. But it is very interesting to say that it's quite present in the course of law. It is one way of training young indigenous people to form in law, to defend the rights of the indigenous people. That has been a strategy not only in Brazil, but in other countries of Latin America. I mean, they have trained people experts in legal issues who are indigenous people. This has promoted a very strong change between these young indigenous people, thus creating other demands of these young people because, of course, they are coming out of their towns, they're going to the universities, they're being educated, they're entering the labor market. So there are a series of discussions that we must take into account regarding the Amazonic communities that was not known before. This has generated a strong transformation in these communities. Another important element in the indigenous struggles in Brazil was the movement that little by little grew, and it is the movement of the Pardismo. The indigenous who say, we don't want to be recognized as Pardo anymore. We want us to be recognized as indigenous, even though we are not in the towns, even though we are in the communities that are African indigenous, like in rural areas. even though we don't have our lands recognized by the government or by the state. So this movement of the pardismo was questioning this classification as pardo, which is very important. It is also very important to take into account that part of the critiques of to the affirmative actions has to do with the fact that there's the risk of putting different minorities disputing amongst themselves for these spaces when the majorities continue to live with in the upper class, and in the lower classes we have the indigenous and the black people fighting amongst themselves for something that is a universal right, which is the right to education. And it is also very important to emphasize that the affirmative actions are not poverty policies. And in general, it is true that they're going to help build a middle class that is Black. And why do I say this? Because in order to enter the university, you have to have the middle school education. And there are many poor people that are not able to finish the school to be able to then take the test for the quotas. These are debates that are very important. And the arrival of Lula, with the arrival of Lula, there was a shift that was fundamental for the institution of the affirmative actions, because what the PT did was to associate the affirmative actions with a series of social policies, of which what Lula did was to double the number of public universities, to more than double the number of spaces for them to enter the university, to double the scholarships that existed for students that wanted to enter the university. That is, there wasn't an increase of the occurrence. On the contrary, there was an exponential growth of the universities in Brazil. This policy to be able to be considered as a policy of correction and not as a policy that was focal. However, the affirmative actions became a federal law that was recognized and approved by the Congress. And there are two types of affirmative actions in Brazil for the Afro population. For the public concourses, 20% of all the public concourses of all the careers, 20% of the spaces should be destined to the Black population. We don't ask them about their social situation. And for all the universities, for all public general universities, it is mandatory to establish 50% of the spaces of the universities are destined to the socio-economical population that is vulnerable. And among this population that is vulnerable, a percentage, there's a specific percentage for indigenous people and a specific percentage for the African population. I have a diagram that I will show to you when we come back from the break. Thank you very much. Let us take then a 15-minute break and then we will continue. Let us take some coffee, drink some coffee.
Can you go to the slide number 54? There we go. For you to see what the federal law says with regards to the number of posts when people are entering these courses. When a student is going to present he or herself or himself for the program of economics. So let's say there are 20 places. 50% of these 20 places are distributed in the following manner. Uh, 50% goes to students from the public schools. The other 50% is distributed through a selection system. Well, from this percentage that goes for students of public schools, the criteria, the criterion of distribution has to do with the level of wage. If you earn less than a minimum wage, and from those that have this wage level, there are a number of places for indigenous people and for black people. And it's important that this percentage that goes for black people and indigenous people depends on the proportion provided by the demographic census. If we are in the Amazonian region and you have this percentage of indigenous people, is going to be higher than in other states, for example. And this applies to all. This system applies to all the federal public universities. The state public universities are not obliged to apply these quotas, but most of universities have this quota system. Some of them follow this methodology, and some others follow the other format I have mentioned that was designed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a number of scholarships or mini courses. When the student fills a form and affirms that he or she belongs to a black community or indigenous people, they will have some extra points so that they can have access to the universities. So there are specific models created by the universities. The University of Brasilia has two systems. One that is mandatory by law, and another system that was created by the institution to provide access to black people. And this system stayed the same since its creation. Most of the country applies it. So the quotas in education do not determine by law the creation of a commission of verification of self-declaration. There are two types of commission. One that has to do with all the applicants that are pretending to access these quotas need to go through a verification of the self-declaration, and then there's the commission that establishes verification if there is a denunciation that a person, for example, is white and filled the form and affirmed he or she was black. And then, with regards to the indigenous population, most of the universities require a letter issued by the chief of the indigenous community certifying that that person actually belongs to this indigenous community. And again, this identification methodology doesn't have to do with origin, but instead of color, that is going to determine precisely how to determine these quotas. So, for example, a person may be considered a beneficiary of the quota and another person may not be benefited. I come from a family that with black people, with white people, but I'm not a person that would have access to the quota, even if I come from a mixed family. And I'm married to a black person, and I have three children. My older daughter could definitely obtain a quota, but one of the other children don't. And this has to do with the social quota. It is expected that when the quotas are established for bureaucracy, for public service, that there are certain pressures from the grassroots movements that a person that would apply for a position coming from a lower level to have access to those quotas. But if you come from a high class, you would expect that person from that high class to pretend to apply to become a beneficiary of the quotas. So, thinking about the universities, there are no so many studies assessing the system and how it worked in terms of the quantitative approach in terms of its efficiency. Why so difficult? When I started to study this, there were two projects that were created for the university. One that had to do with scholarships for the maintenance and precisely giving access to poor population to the university, and the other that is this program to broaden the Brazilian universities that doubled the number of universities because several universities were created and the management attained by the PT was successful. So students from private universities that were not able to make it to the public universities received a scholarship from the government to afford the costs of university. This was a broad program that fostered education, that doubled the amount of university students in Brazil. And several interesting universities were created, such as the University for Latin American Integration in the south of the country. That was the federal university that was graduating people to go to the metallurgic industry, and the Unilabi in the northeast in Bahia, for example. There was a university that was bound to study African affairs that offered scholarships for African students as well. And some other universities in the south of Bahia that have a program that is very ambitious and is a university devoted to the regional development of this area. That is an area that has plenty of indigenous settlements and quilombo communities. There is something interesting in these new universities and in these new universities. We see um, something that goes beyond the traditional departments in a university, sociology, anthropology. No, we have a division by areas of knowledge, and then we have a more formal division. We have training paths related to knowledge areas such as justice, environment, and then there are diplomas related to audiovisual activities. So there is no a formal department structure as we see in other universities related to disciplines. So these are universities that have been considered a failure by some sectors, but they are successful. And for example, one of the universities that focuses on metallurgy was considered a university derived from ideology, and instead it was a successful project. So in these programs, we started to see these quota programs. So this change, this shift, in the system of assigning them. So when when we started to see a large number of black people entering the universities, and people were defining whether it was due to the quota policy or other modifications. And certainly, we started to see a shift in the population composition at the university. I studied in the 80s, and when I studied, only the elite would make it to the university. So it was shameful, given the fact that we live in a diverse country. But if you go now to the university, you see a high level of indigenous students or African descendant students, social diversity, a different face of the university, and different laws have been established. Any advertising effort of the government needs to count on quotas. You need to show the different faces that are present in society. So this was a collective movement that was very significant to face racism, and you can see that in statistics and in the aesthetics, the aesthetics that is now seen in the public spaces that was not seen before. So we can affirm that the quota policies have a significant importance, a symbolic importance in this fight against racism in Brazil. So all this progress of the right wing, they like to say that studying in the public universities is not going to be sustainable if you have to have a black people next to you. That's what the right wingers affirms, and we have seen, the demonstrators from the right wing affirming that. Oh, why our children need to live next to people from other races and social sectors. That's what you hear in demonstrations from the right winger. Oh, how come you can see an airplane of black people flying next to it? So this enabled to see that this myth of racial democracy was basically crumbling, because suddenly you saw these right wingers starting to protest because they're starting with a black next to them, or they are seeing the poor people accessing services that they use. So precisely, you see that the elites are trying to take a vendetta because they see that there are spaces being occupied by people from different social sectors, by people from different cultures and races that are present in Brazil. So clearly, you see a shift here. And we started to see a significant black middle class after the 80s, very a large number of black intellectuals and black successful businessmen and successful black writers. There's an association of black university professors. So we started to see this in Brazilian society. So at the postgraduate level, universities started to apply quotas for accessing posts in postgraduate courses. In my case, in the field of law, we started to open quotas for LG, LQGTB, indigenous, and other groups. We started to We need to consider also that there is a quota established for disabled people, the university, and other elements that have to do with gender parity. So this is the education and how it has evolved at the level of public competitive examinations. Apart from the scholarships in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there was a need of establishing of a percentage of quotas to enter the diplomatic field. These quotas for black people. I teach in the institute that trains diplomats in Brazil, and it was unthinkable this in other uh, times of our country. So the whole diplomatic career was exclusive for the privileged and white classes. But now there is the possibility of seeing in these courses of the trained diplomats for diplomatic career. Now you see diversity. So there's a large number of black women now taking these courses to enter the diplomatic career because there has been a program of mentorship to prepare men to be prepared for this competitive examination for the diplomatic career. And with this, many women have entered the diplomatic career. So there are plenty of very interesting initiatives working to strengthen this type of policies. The complaints and the conflicts. Well, the truth is that we need to take into account, as the black leaders say, well, we need to take into account the context of Brazil. If we would remain silent, change would not be possible. So that is why it was so important to demand the need for places so for everyone. So there was a lot of silence about this previous discrimination. So against this idea that we may have, the self-declaration omission for verifications are contemplated by law for public service, and based on this law that extended to regulate these quotas in the education field, when Bolsonaro came to office, they started to attack the system of quotas in Brazil. And something was quite surprising. The quotas ended up consolidating instead of disappearing. So all the polls and surveys about the acceptance of the quotas, nobody complained about the quotas. So even though they were trying to reverse these policies were well designed. But more than the policies, it was the implementation of these policies. These are policies that have consolidated remarkably in Brazil. So the opinion of the society towards these policies, even in the right wing, was favorable to this system of quotas. So we know that the right wingers are against the quotas and that they attack the poor. But when they realized that they didn't count on the support of the population to abolish the quotas, it was easy to say, okay, then let's suspend the scholarship. Let's attack the public universities. Let's take the money away from the universities. And this has to do with the resources of the university in Brazil.
Take the money out of the university, and by that, you will be eliminating the quotas. You don't need to attack the policies. They only work if there are public universities. And for the public competitions, what did they do? They privatized the public services. They didn't make not even one public competition. They froze all the public competitions. They decreased the public machinery. So with this, they killed the policy without even saying a word to question it. So what we saw was the end of a policy without attacking it directly because we knew that it had an ample acceptance by the society. But there's another thing. The quota were established in a temporary manner. The law established 10 years. After 10 years, they made an evaluation because the affirmative policies are temporary measures. And when you have a parity of participation, the policy doesn't have sense to exist anymore. So you can imagine the case of Bahia, where the Black people are a gigantic population. They have a quota of 50%. Well, by that, you don't solve the problem. For the Black people in Bahia to have access to the university, we need many more universities. And this was done. Bahia has approximately 3 or 4 federal campuses. There's a strong presence of public universities there. So I wanted to leave you this. This quota complemented complete 10 years during the government of Bolsonaro in the previous Congress. But what they achieved in the previous Congress was to suspend the evaluation of the policy to finish the period of Bolsonaro with the excuse of the COVID, to let the abolition to come later on. The quota today are approved without limit of time. The quotas in Brazil still remain. The public service, the quote and the validity will finish this year. So there's a project of law in order to continue them, and they were extended for several sectors. And I am now going to show you something that shocked us, and that is that, just give me 1 minute for me to find the slide here. I had the slide here just a few minutes ago. Please, could you show slide number 50? I don't know if you have internet. Are you connected? Because this is the map of the affirmative actions. Yes, it is possible. Otherwise, there's no problem. The quote for the public bureaucracy is a quota of federal public service. And if we can increase the map of Brazil, please, and it was determined, no, please, smaller in order to show the country. Okay. And it was determined by the executive. Even during the government of Bolsonaro, what was more terrible was that the powers, all of them, the judicial power, started to establish quotas, and it was not mandatory by law. So today, when there are competitions for judges and magistrates, they have courts. When they are competitions for the executive, for the judicial power and legislative power, they have quotas. There was the establishment of quotas in the public services in the country, even during the government of Bolsonaro. And we were shocked. This was an investigation that we did where we mapped all the competitions of quotas and the country and the service, the public service. And you can see that there are states where we have the small spots. That's because there's a legend where you can choose which is the power, if it's federal, municipal, state power, what type of competition, if they have commissions or not, how the selection is made, etc. And we must be very careful, because if we live this way, there are competitions where they make a blood test, where they make a table of the physical traits of the person. So there is a risk. There's always many risks, so we have to be watchful. But this is a policy that wasn't mandatory. It is all around the powers of the republic. Now there are systems of quotas in careers that we did not imagine, like for the competitions of judges, they have quota systems. And now This advanced even more because the quotas in the public service, in the federal public service, was due to the public competitions that were permanent. But every politician has the different positions. And now there are quotas for commissioned positions. Their advisors have to have people, Black people. And there are municipalities that established quotas even for practices. They have to establish quotas for the practices. There are frauds, there are systems of mocking, but there are difficulties because there is not a regulation to know if the access to the career is being respected or if the Black people tend to stay in the lower levels of the public careers. This is under debate. Right now, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, what they're fighting is that it's not only the entry or the advancement in the career, but there has to be a system that allows the representative can go upwards, even women and men. And the discussion the debate that we have in Brazil in the public service is that we should have a system not only for the establishment of percentage, but to guarantee that this population can reach the highest levels of the decision-making process in Brazil. So this is a politics for a country like Brazil that has broadened significantly. And that is what we say, like in other countries, the extreme right cannot accept something like that. There's no way. There was a change in terms of representative in the public service. And the most incredible thing is that even with the National Congress taken by the extreme right, with a great proportion of the extreme right, it is the first Congress that has the highest number of Black politicians and transsexual deputies or congressmen. All around the country, we have several congressmen that are transsexual and that are indigenous. This is a fundamental change. Even though the quotas were for the Black population, there was an empowerment to say that for these populations to vindicate their rights, one of the flagships of the extreme right is what they call the gender policy for women, for the demands of the LGBTQ plus group. They are threatening the families, etc., according to them. This is a discourse that they have. And nowadays, even though they are recognized at the level of the Supreme Court, once again, the quota policies, there was a demand made by the right in the Supreme Court saying that it was unconstitutional and it was against the equality of all the people. This was done years ago, and the Supreme Court passed a law saying that it was constitutional because the Constitution foresees the equality, and this is a policy that promotes the equality. This is another important aspect. It's not a multiculturalist policy, it's a policy for promoting equity. Nobody is defending differences. We are defending equality, an equality that is actually effective. And now the Congress last week was judging a law, studying a law to suspend the right of marriage between homosexual people, which was a right that had been guaranteed in Brazil. So marriage was approved between homosexual people a long time ago, as well as the automatic changes of the names of the transsexual people. And what we see in this Congress is a gigantic discourse to reverse all these changes that were made in the last years in Brazil. And Lula even sent a proposal for the salary parity between men and women in the private sectors. So now there's a very strong demand of the companies of the discussion of diversities, not only because they're very good, but it's a pressure for the adaptation to this system and to the new legislations. And that's because many of those companies, when they make acts of racism, immediately the press and the movement make such a gigantic publicity. They're so pressured by the justice. Remember that the racism crime is punishable by law, 5 years of jail. Even though many few processes reach the end, this is quite visible, and there was a very strong empowerment. An interesting example was the Carrefour supermarket. A black man was murdered by the security people of the market that had accused him of making a robbery. It was a black people. It was a supermarket. So once the black person entered the supermarket, they start to watch him because they think he's a robber. People started to denounce, and this case of the market was quite emblematic. There aren't mechanisms yet to punish the company as a whole. It is just a symbolic punishment. But there was a very strong campaign for that the Carrefour made a commission to evaluate the situation, etc. There was another case. There are cases every day, but this has promoted a pressure on the companies that is quite strong. So now the other pathway is how do we enter the anti-racist struggle within the companies? Since there's a middle class that is black and it is more represented in several environments. Now, with the government of Lula, they created the Secretariat of Racial Equality, but now we have also the Ministry of the Racial Equality, led by a Black woman. We have the Secretariat for the Ministry for Human Rights, where the minister is a Black intellectual that is well known in Brazil, who has written a lot about the structural racism. We have the Ministry of the Indigenous Peoples, which is led by an indigenous congresswoman, Sonia Badajaro. This is a gigantic change. The indigenous people were always in charge of the National Foundation of the Indigenous People, and it was not occupied by indigenous. They were anthropologists, public servants, but now we have the ministry where the minister, the vice deputy minister, all of them are indigenous. And we also have another entity led by an indigenous person. This is a great step to take the indigenous people out of the situation of tutelage. And let me tell you that when a government establishes their ministries or creates their ministries, they have to send to the National Congress, and it is the National Congress the one that approves or not the ministries. The president doesn't have the power to create the ministry as he wishes. And the ministries of Lula's were studied through provisory measurements, and the extreme right did everything they can in order not to create the Ministry of Racial Equality and the Ministry of Indigenous People. They did everything they could, mainly for the indigenous people. So since the extreme right is quite related to business, there's a strong pressure on these indigenous ministry and the control of the indigenous people. We must remember that during the government of Bolsonaro, there was a lot of genocide of Yanomamis in the country. So it is very difficult. The political system is quite tied to the National Congress, especially There wasn't a constitutional change. There wasn't a referendum, but the National Congress decided to live with semi-presidentialism and that the president doesn't have any more power in Brazil. So for you to understand the situation, but at the same time, we have to consider that if there is a Brazilian society that is still retrograde, conservative, of the extreme right, whatever, there is a society that has changed a lot, that has made a lot of progress, and that has empowered in a very significant manner. How can we interpret this nowadays? And this has been my hypothesis. We are at a new moment in our history where we have to rethink what the state wants and what type of national identity wants we want in the country. Because like we did in the beginning of the 20th century, based on the three races and the invisibilization of the racism, this is not accepted anymore. So the idea is to discuss what type of country we want to have. And we are having an open struggle to understand. But the truth is that since the beginning of the government of Bolsonaro, he didn't continue, but the extreme right was defending a conservative country, a religious country, and a pro-family country. They take advantage of the idea of the Brazilian family that should be protected. I don't know if I should stop or if I must continue. Do you have any question about the design of the affirmative actions? Does anyone want to ask any question? Well, we can have a session of questions and answers. There we have a podium.
So those who ask questions, there's some echo, so try to speak out loud. Hello. I just wanted to understand further the quota system. We have heard you speaking about this in depth. The quotas in universities also involved scholarships, or it was only granting the possibility to enter the university for some groups. If there's a quota of 20% of access to university for Black people, the rest, the 80%, the remaining 80% can also be granted to Black people, or that percentage is fixed, that quota, or are there scholarships to help people to pursue university studies? Look, the law does not demand scholarships. However, scholarships are given to quota holders in terms of priority. If the Black person is applying for this quota and has high scores, and that would enter the university without having to access the quotas, well, the idea is that if you have good GPA, you enter directly university, and that quota is reassigned to another person. So if you have that person uh, that could have access to the system without receiving the quota is given to someone else. And the same happens for diplomacy. If you obtain a high score when you're applying to become a diplomat, you are selected on the basis of your performance, and then this quota is given to another person. So if I'm a Black person and I don't want to be selected on the basis of a quota, I can go to the regular selection system. So when you register, you decide if you want to apply for the quota or not. And this is very important at the moment of filling the necessary forms. And that's the problem. If you don't have a broad policy of scholarships, for example, in Brazil, if there is not a solid system of scholarships, then the quotas are not going to work well. And this started to cause problems in terms of the quotas during the government of Bolsonaro, and specifically during the pandemic. The uh, drop off of students who cannot afford studying at the university was really high, the drop off rate. And this is a fundamental discussion. We need to continue changing things for good. And in federal universities in Brazil, you have uh, academic activities the whole day. It's very difficult to have a job and study at the same time. So many people cannot afford not working and being at the university, or some families have a hard time keeping a student successfully at the university. So precisely, it became necessary to readjust the amount of those scholarships. Another fundamental element that needs to be addressed is what happens with the racism situations that take place within the university, because students are in the university and they can continue to be victims of racism. They may enter the university, but they continue to be victims. There is harassment, sexual harassment, racism, and this takes place in the university, and there are mechanisms against that. However, there needs to be an entity that could be effective to combat racism within the universities. What happens in these type of situations? So what happens is that students are then mobilized, because when you have a situation like that in the universities, in situations that end up appearing in social media, there are efforts of cancellation. When there is this when this person is pointed out as a racist person, this person ends up suffering from cancellation. That's very important. Pressure is very important. Some things happens very fast. So if a situation takes place, you start to see cancellation in social media. See, if there was a situation of a professor that allegedly committed racism, this case starts to appear in social media, and the career of that professor may end up being destroyed. But that's not a problem of racism, but instead a problem in social media. So it's necessary to verify if facts actually happened the way they're described, because policies cannot just be used by anyone to destroy another person. So, for example, if a student does not obtain good grades, this student cannot falsely accuse the professor of being racist. So, we need to be careful about risks, and that has to do with an improvement of policy. We need to make sure that university levels can deal successfully with this type of problems to avoid exaggerations and injustices, so that we don't end up having a coercive policy. This is complex. There are situations of this kind that we have seen. So, what is mentioned among the indigenous students at the university, sometimes there are problems that have to do with language, apart from the racism problems. What type of departments are there to help? Many departments or offices are not enough prepared to support these students. There was a national examination each university has this examination, competitive examination, but there is a national competitive examination to enter universities. These are academic tests taken by the students that public universities or state universities may associate to apply this type of competitive examination. And sometimes what the universities do is select the best students that score high in these competitive examinations. This might be an indigenous student from a different region. And maybe the university has a good psychological support to receive indigenous students. So, University of Brasilia has a specific office, a place designed by the university due to the concern expressed by the indigenous students. So this department in the University of Brasilia receives these indigenous students, and they have reinforcement and support courses and workshops. They created themselves a structure within the university, and the university supports them, but they were able to create their own structure at the university to um, support the presence of indigenous students in public universities. So it's not perfect what we have in terms of support and scholarship. And I believe that during the government of the Party of Workers, PT, maybe the support is not perfect. However, a remarkable effort has been made to provide emotional support to these students that are entering a hostile environment. Because you can imagine the first group of quota beneficiaries that entered the universities, how they were treated. One of the critics posed against the quotas is that these quotas may create a stigma against the beneficiaries. In fact, there is a policy for no identification of the quota holders or the quota beneficiaries. So the fact that you're black does not necessarily mean that you are a quota beneficiary. So there is a policy of de-identification to keep these quota holders or beneficiaries anonymous. So the idea was precisely to make sure that people, well, applied for quotas, and you have some cases in which you have persons that do not belong to minorities, white people saying that they received the benefit of quotas and they were not supposed to receive them. However, nowadays, I see that many students say openly that they're quota beneficiaries, not only black people, but other beneficiaries, students from public schools, and they affirmed with pride that they have been benefited. And we need to move forward. I've seen the case of some influencers from the right wing, and they say they're not political, and they said that they were benefited by the quotas, and they don't defend this policy, and they were able to study in the public university thanks to that. So how come they do not they defend, sorry. So what is the challenge of the left at this point? Is to make possible a commitment of the quota beneficiaries with its with their policies, with the policies that benefited them. So let's keep when people say let's keep the de-identification of the quota beneficiaries. If we want these policies to be successful, they need to say and assume I was benefited by the quotas. I'm a quota beneficiary. So I see this is the moment after what I have witnessed and after seeing quota beneficiaries defending Bolsonaro, we need to say, okay, quota beneficiaries need to be committed with these policies. If we keep this the identification of the quota beneficiaries, because we don't have access to the statistics in the public sector to know who was benefited for the quotas to enter in the public administration. If we don't do this, we don't know to what positions are these quota beneficiaries reaching. We need to evaluate the efficiency of these quota policies. So, myself, along with the colleagues in my project, we always say it's not nothing to be ashamed. Public and social policy is nothing that you need to be ashamed of. No. Instead, I see with great concern how people start to stigmatize social policies. Social policies are good, are a reason to feel proud, and that's part of the debate we're holding after the administration of Bolsonaro. It was important to mention that it's necessary to count on the commitment of those that benefited from these quotas and these policies, and they were able to obtain managerial positions. So these people are beneficiaries and they end up criticizing these policies. You have women who are deputies who have received these benefits and they speak bad about the quotas, they speak about the feminists and the policies, and they were benefited. So if it was not because of the parity and the possibility of entering the Congress, how you, deputy, would be there? So the commitment to the policy is necessary. So there is a movement called Free Brazil or Brazil Libre that organized the rallies against Dilma. This extreme right wing learned how to conduct street demonstration. They learned how to take the streets. Only the left was present in the streets in the past, but now the right wingers go to the streets. So in 2003, it was horrible to see these rallies took place in Sao Paulo after an increase of public transportation. Right wingers took control of the streets and started to demonstrate. A lot of fake news started to take place, and there was an association of young people, the movement Brasil Libre, Free Brazil, whose leader is a black guy that is a right wing, an extreme right wing association that started to take the streets against the corruption of PT. And then there was this scandal, the Lava Jato, the scandal with the judges of the right wing, all these scandals, you know, this whole process full of lies and the whole trap that was created against Lula. And you could go to the Economica Avenue in Sao Paulo, and there was a big rally of rich people, you know, the businessman, the rich businessman, the rich woman, the nanny, taking the baby, protesting in the street. And in this avenue in Sao Paulo, there is the Association of the Industries offering food such as filet mignon and fine food for the demonstrators because they had a problem. And Lula, in times of the PT, guaranteed full labor rights for domestic employees. So it was ironic to see the nanny there. So, and it became very expensive to have a house employee in Brazil because you needed to pay maternity leave and everything and all these benefits to the housekeepers or any house employee or domestic employee. And these people who were protesting there, their discourse was the following: we cannot afford our domestic employees. It was surreal to see this. The whole topic of domestic employees is always hitting the news. How the domestic employees are becoming more expensive. This is the worst heritage that we have had after the slavery. The the wealthy people cannot afford anymore, they say, their domestic employees. So the minimum wage has increased. In São Paulo, it's impossible to have a domestic employee. They are strongly associated. They have a very strong union of domestic employees in Brazil. This turned into a war. And this is present in the discourse of the right wing. This is the slavery system that they defend. And we saw these rallies and we couldn't believe our eyes. So you had these rich people protesting in the Paulista Avenue along with their nannies, their domestic employees. And they were supporting, the ideas of Bolsonaro. But when the left starts to discuss with these black guys from the right wing, you know what they did? These black right wingers, they went to justice and denounced racism. They ended up becoming deputies, Congress representatives. And then, you know, you start to say, well, you can accuse the left of being racist because there is a law that was promoted by the left that gives the possibility to denounce racism. And you went to university thanks to the changes that took place. So this is a very complex moment. So it's necessary to create a commitment of the policy beneficiaries with the policies that benefited them. And so you end up creating a middle class that lacks political awareness. So it's very important to have a middle class with political awareness, because otherwise you have this new middle class that received the benefits in the past that ends up turning against a progressive government or progressive ideas. So you see, for example, in the churches, people that voted for Lula that received benefits in the past, and you see what they say. You hear them say, Lula is much better for those who receive benefits derived from social policies. But I vote for Bolsonaro because I'm worried about the family and the moral, even if Lula is better. And you say, what? And this is what we're dealing with. This is what we're seeing in Brazil. Social policies are sufficient to keep these people satisfied? No. Political awareness is necessary. What can Lula does? Well, you know, of course, fixing the ministries, recomposing the policies that Bolsonaro implemented. 700,000 people died out of COVID, and Bolsonaro did nothing. And I hear people saying, especially those who are in the churches.
But they associated the PT to these policies for transsexual people and for women. And now last week, for you to have an idea, there was a fake news that said that Lula and the Ministry of Human Rights were creating unisex bathrooms. Lula had just launched a new social project for the church, and immediately there was a fake news of that type. And this generated a lot of movement and demonstrations of the evangelical people. And then came the ministry, and then Lula came promoting unisex bathrooms. But these people do not have access to this information, because what they say to these pastors is that they cannot go to the TV channels and read this. They are in their bubble, in their special bubble. And that is a drama. It is a challenge for us. I mean, how to create a commitment for these people with the social policies. And there is a religious conservationism that is extremely difficult to overcome. We in the university, and this looks like a joke, but I had the situation. I had poor students. I am a teacher of social sciences. I am an anthropologist of the Department of Soil Sciences, and I had poor students who said that this is how I learned it. The globe is not round, because that was the extreme right. They talked about the creationism, etc. So suddenly, if the social sciences have to be treated with some negationists who are defending the creationism, the religion, things that if I had not seen myself in my classroom, I would have never imagined. I could not imagine. One cannot imagine what is happening. And how can do you dialogue with these people? How can you approach these people? There is a work that we are not doing right now. There's a place that the churches are reaching and that we are not reaching, because the policies are very pretty, they're very beautiful, they're there, they're being implemented, but there's a social group that is poor and that is conservative, and we are not able to speak to them, and they're not voting for the left. They're beneficiaries of these policies, but they're not voting. They're voting for the right. I hope it would be the right. No, they vote for the extreme right. And this is what shocks us. How can we imagine one Black person voting for a politician that agrees with neo-Nazism? So it is a drama. There's a lot to do with these policies. There's a lot to work with. And unfortunately, I must say that sometimes the left, people from the left wing fight too much among themselves. And there's another risk about identitarianism, neoliberal anti-tarianism. It's not just working with identities that are individual, that have self-declarations, and each one of them starts to define itself. They say, well, I am transsexual, I am travesti, I am a woman. The associations of Black feminists, the associations of white feminists, they all start discussing, but these guidelines cannot be separated from the discussion of racial equality or of other types of equalities. How to keep them combined in order not to run the risk of falling into a policy that has to do only with identification. How can we ensure what Brazil has invented, which was better, in order to combine these policies like other countries did to equality? How to combine these policies with equality? This is very important, and it was done in Brazil, and we have to remember this all the time. It is not a difference politics. It is a politics of equality, of promoting equality. With regards to the way of lives, the different ways of life, not only of Black people who are indigenous, but people of the LGBTQ community, etc. So there's a lot. We who work with these topics, it is very complicated for us. We have lots of doubts. There are movements that say, oh, this is far from the discussion. The discussion is too focused in the identities for neoliberalism. Now there's a problem with working with the identities. With neoliberalism, there's no problem working with the identities. So the thing is to be, how to link. And something that I say a lot to my students, the identities are flexible, contextual. And I, Rebecca, I am a woman, I am white, or I am Black, I am parda, I am from the Afro religion, or I am evangelical. What position is like more important for people for the left. And like social sciences are more used to treating with these topics, but this is a topic that all the areas of knowledge are discussing about. We must remember all the time what Foggia said. They are contextualized. The identities are contextualized because they're individual. What is permanent? And there, the situation there is a structural. What racism does, what the project of national identity is, what the state is, these are structural. But the identifications are personal, and this is something that we have to be careful about in order not to mix things, because otherwise the Black woman, transsexual, will have difficulty dialoguing with a Black woman who is not transsexual, and this has to be avoided. So did I answer the question? There's another question that somebody had from yesterday.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. My name is Bril Vizcaya. I also work for the Simon Bolivar Institute. Thank you very much to our friend Rebecca for all the information, and mainly during the first 2 days for explaining the historical context and some social features of Brazil. And in order not to extend myself, I'm going to be specific, like in a timeline. And starting from those differences that were born between the different crowns or monarchies that colonized the continent since 1884 with the Treaty of Tordesillas, which establishes the difference between the Spanish monarchy and the Portuguese monarchy on the territories that constitute this area of the continent. Starting from that, the differences is that it is the only monarchy that migrates to the American continent and that is settles here. But not only that, but that it is a monarchy that, apart from settling, gives the first step to constitute the independence of Brazil, which is very different from all the other independentist spaces, at least in the Hispanic area, where the oligarchies are revealed against a policies of taxes by the Spanish monarchy. And also how the influence of a book that I showed you before, that I showed Rebecca before, which is the book that is called Casa Grande en Sensala, which is a book that she promoted the first day by Gilberto Freire. There, Gilberto establishes the consequences, the social consequences of the historical confirmation of the Casa Grande and of the whole system, that from an economic point of view was quite similar to one of the United States with lots of intellectuals, like was the case of Freire and Fernandez in Canada. And Freire there talks about the plantation subject, which is very different from the topic of the hacienda. This left us with a Brazil that, even though it does not have a racism like the one in the United States that has to do with the skin color, it is a racism that is a racism between the North or a poor Northeast and the South with coffee that has another ethnical composition. Even with these plans of migrants that I accepted from Italy and that were moved to the South, but that were forced to be integrated. So I wanted to ask you, even though you established, based on an author, there was an author that said that not only the income was going to determine, but the analysis on the life conditions. But I do think that is necessary because when we see the negative figures, the Black population is the one that suffers more violence. In the case of Black women, the people overcomes the figure. If the negative numbers are the ones that in this moment are considered, what happens not only with these affirmative actions in the Northeast, which is a zone where the workers' party is, there is a differentiated statistic for the Black population, mainly because regional governments survived there and local governments of PT survived there during Bolsonaro. That is why some social programs, in spite of the reduction of the budget, might have survived in the Northeast. So there are differentiated statistics in the Northeast. That is my first question. With regards to the increase of the life quality of Black populations. A second question. This one has to do if the Quilombo space or the Quilombolas have a political proposal, or if the Quilombolas, and I don't know about this, or the Quilombolas are Black communities that receive affirmative actions, or they have a political proposal for the future. Do they have a political contribution, the Quilombos, with respect to the construction of a social and democratic society? I have a third question that has to do with religion. In the electoral discussion, it says that the vice presidential combination with Lula represented some Catholic areas that could be more tolerant with the religious expressions of the African descent religions, while Bolsonaro intolerated the fundamentalists. So at this moment, the left, the Afro movement, do they have any response from a subjective point of view for the national debate? Thank you very much. Well, those are different questions. I'm going to start with the book Casa Grande from Gilberto Freire. Nowadays, it is not a book that is recommended by the Black movement. Even though Gilberto Freire didn't talk about racial democracy, when he built this book, Casa Grande, that spoke about this cohabitation and the Casa Grande of between the enslaved, the whites, and the masters, he sort of cleaned or disappeared the part of violence. Mm, But we also must take into account that most of those women that were in the Casa Grande were raped, they suffered all types of abuses from those people. So even though there was this space, there were interracial marriages. We had powerful women who were Black. There, it was a violence that was permanent. And what Gilberto Freire did, which was very important to answer the racist theories, but he did not consider the violence that was present during slavery. So there's a strong critique to Gilberto Freire and on his formula of harmony that he invented, which had to do with the, the tale of the three races, Black, indigenous, and white. So that is why Gilberto Freire is very critiqued. They don't want to teach Gilberto Freire in the university anymore. But I tell the students this is part of the history. It was something important for the theoretical and racist, for the history of the racial relationships in Brazil. And tell the students that to critique someone, you have to read that person. This is very important because Gilberto Freire is extremely related to the construction of this national identity of democracy, etc. That on one hand. On the other hand, before the quotas, Brazil had social policies and democratization, and there were more and more Black students that were able to complete middle education. You know the idea of the glass roof for the study of genders? Since the problem is not racism, but the social class, when a Black person goes up in the social scale, he is still suffering racism. And there are very important milestones of cases of intellectuals and artists that buy a luxurious car. They get off their car and he is accused of having robbed the car. If he goes into a luxurious hotel, they treat him as if he was a driver because they don't think he's the owner of the. So if it's just a social class, what happens with this middle Black class that is going up and that is still suffering the same racism? So apart from the statistics, from the 70s, the Black peoples are overrepresented in the lowest classes. Regarding the Northeast is not homogeneous. It's a land of colonials, of families. Remember the captainships of the divisions of the lands for the great families of Portugal? It's a state with a lot of racism. So statistics were not there for the Northeast between the poor population and the rich population. How do sociologists justify adding Pardo plus Pretos? The sociologists say this can be done with different actions, but statistically and socially, we can combine them because compared to the whites and pardos and pretos, they are at the same social level. So that is the justification of the sociologists when they say that they can combine them. It's complicated because maybe we are assigning them an identification with which they're not identified, but maybe the economical social level of the pardos and the pretos are quite similar. The quilombos, in terms of political proposals, quilombos are very diverse, but anyhow, they are very important and they visibilize the recovery. They are a symbol of the recovery of a series of African tradition, of the formation of a Black resistance that is extremely important and that will form one type of communitary organization that is very significant. So for the Black movement, even the quilombos have a fundamental relevance because the indigenous are originary peoples. The Black tend to be like the foreigners that came from abroad, and the quilombos give the idea of ancestors, of people who were settled in the country. And something that is very good with the affirmative actions is the recognition of their contribution. I couldn't talk about this, but there are two laws in Brazil that were passed many years ago that were approved where they forced teaching the African Brazilian culture and the history of Africa at schools, public and private schools. That is in the school curriculum. All the schools must teach this. It is difficult. it is not well implemented. We need professors that specialized in the history of Africa. It is complicated. However, these are very important laws. Eh, And we must revisit the history of Brazil with a perspective of Africa. The PT of Lula was very important because during his first government and now, and he already did it, he made lots of visits to Africa. He has already been to Africa again with this idea to work together with them. So this has a symbolic role that is very important in the country of bringing Africa to Brazil. And there's a matter of self-esteem in this discussion. Finally, eventually we can introduce the Black people, but we must introduce them with a past, with a history, with references, and children, the effect on children, to see reflected on advertisements in the schools, in the books. That is something very important. It is a change that to me, I think it's the most important one, to have an impact on the way those people introduce themselves and live more proudly. Regarding religion, the Catholic Church has two sides. The one that supports the dictatorship. We are talking a lot about Bolsonaro with the evangelical people, but he had a lot of support of representatives of the Opus Dei. The Opus Dei is silent. They only talk about evangelical, but they don't talk about the conservative Catholics. Everyone remains silent, but the Ministry of Family, which was led by an evangelical woman who was elected deputy or senator of the Republic. She was the Ministry of Family. She transformed the Ministry of Human Rights into the Ministry of Family during the Bolsonaro government. And the National Congress approved the ministerial reform of Bolsonaro. I believe that the niece of a minister of the Superior Court of Labor, who is a conservative that is linked to the conservative Catholic churches and that had a lot of force, and that supported an association that depended on the intelligent saint. Some you have to enter the website and write design inteligente. It's a theory. It's a scientific theory that scientifically defends the creationism, which is quite expanded in the world. There is even a Brazilian association for the promotion of the design inteligente, which has a lot of politicians, intellectuals. Don't think that these ideas are of people who have not studied. There are a lot of intellectuals of the extreme right. There is even an international association that meets in Hungary, I think. Where is Victor Orban? There is an association in Hungary. Victor Orban. They're, they're defenders of freedom. You have to have freedom to be racist. Demography, democracy, which is something against abortion, and Association for the Defense of Family. And the extreme right of the whole world participates, and this minister participated in this group of the extreme right. So we have to be careful because there are sectors of the Catholic churches. The problem is that we are scared now with the evangelical. and they're much more discreet. They're much more dangerous because the elites participate here, because the evangelical, the families, the rich families don't say that they are evangelical. They say that they're Catholics because the evangelical ones are the poor people. So in Brazil, there's a tradition of a Catholicism, of a theology of freedom, which is quite present and quite active in the social fights. And the difference from the colonization, even due to the way of domination that we had in Brazil, from the religion syncretism between the African cultures and the church. People frequented two churches. There was a tolerance for the African cults. So there was a mechanism of cohabitation between the Catholic Church and the African cult. The problem is that if it was possible to be Catholic and to go to the Afro cult, because for the Catholic Church, since we were the most Catholic country in the world, we had to check if people were really Catholic and loyal to the religion. The rupture came with the Pentecostal church. Their first act was to directly attack the Afro cults. This was the dynamic. And on the second aspect, they not only attacked the Afro cult, they attacked the Catholic Church. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, we had a pastor. They there was a manifestation where they broke the images. They say bad words about the Catholic virgins. So they also attack the church. And mainly, they attack the popular Catholicism. There were priests of those churches that had their churches invaded, and this happened a lot during the government. So there are Catholic sectors that are linked to this fight, but we must say that there are conservative Catholic sectors. And there's something terrible that has happened during the elections of Catholic sectors, of Catholic churches that destroyed the Pope. They said he was a communist, he couldn't give opinions in Brazil, he couldn't give opinions about the Catholicism. The Pope suffered attacks during the elections, incredible attacks. You can imagine the Catholic churches attacking the Pope this way. And to worsen the situation, since the Pope is a friend of Lula, it was fatal. And that is the most incredible thing. Bolsonaro is Catholic. His wife is evangelical. He was baptized. And after he won the election, he never stepped on an evangelical church again. What is he doing right now? He's being condemned due to different crimes. That is why there's a revenge with the Supreme Court. He's been condemned. He was declared he cannot be elected for the next 8 years. That is why the Congress is acting that way. So he has been condemned. When his condemnation came out, during the weekend, he appeared in the evangelical church. So when he needs the church, he runs to the church. And when he doesn't, then he does the opposite. And it's curious because Lula goes to the church. Sometimes the leftist people is very Catholic. Yeah, they always need the support of the Catholic churches and the theology. Bolsonaro he is now in his third marriage. He has children from different women. Bolsonaro has a long story. He's a Christian, an exemplary one. But people are so blind. You can be all this. The discourse of Bolsonaro when he was a deputy, Bolsonaro defended abortion. He said that abortion had to exist because we couldn't let the poor people reproduce themselves. So the defense of abortion was horrible. It is horrible what this man said. I tend to say that nobody was surprised by Bolsonaro. From the work he did in the Chamber of Deputies years ago, he talked about those types of things. He's condemned because he told a deputy that that she was very ugly. Now there's a condemnation that says that if son of his is homosexual, then he would kill him. And the worst thing is that his sons go out with other men, and everyone knew who Bolsonaro was and what type of attacks he made. And it's so crazy that the whole propaganda the Bolsonaro called the myth is that Bolsonaro came to be, and there were pictures of Bolsonaro with weapons. In the demonstration of evangelical, they are all carrying weapons because Bolsonaro came to accomplish the evangelical mission. That is why it's a myth. With weapons, with firearms, something that is quite absurd. I found a pamphlet and I asked some evangelical friends, and the pamphlet said that Bolsonaro came to be what to do what Christ didn't dare to do. But this is a Christian church. And these are not jokes. This is the level of things that we're trying. And yes, sometimes I believe that we, the left people, are very naive because we start to fight thinking that the extreme right is defeated. And this week we see Lula talking about new policies and the fake news of the unisex bathroom. You realize that no, this is not solved. The issue is not solved. Not only the social policies of distribution is what going to solve the problem. I swear that in my life, I had never imagined seeing what we are seeing with Bolsonaro in Brazil. Nothing, we had never thought that there was such a religious fundamentalism in Brazil. We had never imagined something like that. This is the level that we had, but we had never imagined it.
There is a lack of understanding when it comes to refer to the right wingers of Israel. They are uh, linked to the right wingers in Israel. They're Nazis and they're pro Israel at the same time. There are so many contradictions. The academia is trying to understand what's going on. Up to this moment, we are trying to understand. Well, Bolsonaro was a consequence of social media, but there are many people who are illiterate that have no access to social media and they support Bolsonaro. Maybe WhatsApp. Well, WhatsApp made possible the victory in the elections. WhatsApp was fundamental. You know that there are phones that are there are phones that are not phones that only are useful for WhatsApp. You're not able to make phone calls, but WhatsApp is available on them. So WhatsApp was crucial. So Bolsonarism took advantage of WhatsApp bots. So and you have the work of these churches that is quite effective, that allows this group to spread fake information. You have the polls showing 30% still voting for a person like Bolsonaro, and you need to take that into account. I think we have ran out of time. I think I just want to share with you the chart of the construction of national identity that the Bolsonarismo promotes. So it's not exclusively Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro doesn't have the capacity by himself, but the thing is that there is a group, an international group, that has a project of state that is quite dangerous. They have a project of state and it's very dangerous. It's not only Bolsonaro. So tomorrow we can take half of the time to precisely discuss this. Thank you, Rebecca, for your remarkable presentation today. Thank you all for taking part in this meeting. It is very important to be present during the meeting because remember, we're going to wrap up this activity with Rebecca and the closure of the seminar we have held since August. So please be in this space with us to have a great closure. So see you tomorrow at the same time and in the same place. Bon appetit.